Hello and welcome to UFO Narrative. I'm your host, Tony G. And if you like the video that you're about to watch, please like it. And if you want to subscribe, subscribe. Hey, believers, welcome. Non-believers, welcome. People on the fence, welcome. We're going to look at the myriad perspectives of this topic, okay, over the next few episodes. And I hope I'm going to do a whole bunch of episodes. I hope people really enjoy this topic and are interested in it. If you are, please, again, like and subscribe, right? We've been polarized over the past 10 years or so, all right? And we need to stop it, all right? Just stop it. If someone has a different viewpoint than you do, don't ridicule them, right? Entertain their viewpoint. Speak intelligently about it. Converse, because the only way we learn is through the myriad perspectives that surround us, right? That's what makes it interesting. If everybody believed the same thing, how boring would that be, right? Now, honestly, I will tell you flat out that I do lean towards the believer side, and the reason is I've seen things I can't explain, right? So I welcome disparate viewpoints. I welcome them. I embrace them. So please, let me know what you think. Now, the purpose of this channel is to explore the narratives controlling these stories, all right? And what the intent is of the narrative. Now, it's interesting to note that, of course, those people who win the wars, historically, they write the history books. But are the history books accurate? Or are they embellished? Right? Good question. Now, concerning the UFO, UAP phenomenon, I'd like to discuss the types of people that are involved in this, all right? Number one, we have the people who have seen a UFO or a UAP. And by the way, UFO is unidentified flying object. UAP is unidentified aerial phenomenon. UFO is so much more sexier, don't you think? But in any case, people who've seen UFOs or UAP, and it's an experience. And so their narrative is, they have an experiential narrative. Now, there are people who see them and lean towards a more conventional explanation. They go, well, it was a plane, it was a planet Venus, it was swamp gas, whatever, okay? And like, that's all it was. And then there are people who are just dismissive about the whole thing. You know, well, I don't believe in them. Now, there's also people who have come forward who have either worked with these materials and or entities, all right, or who have secondhand information concerning them. And I'm talking about the recent congressional hearings, right? Well, they've come forward about this. It's pretty brave, right? Because no more than before 2017, before the New York Times ran that article on UFOs, and then it was okay to talk about them, and people weren't idiots who saw them and weren't crazy, right? You were ridiculed. And a dear friend of mine, Mike, he and I I've been talking about it for years. We still talk about it and how things have changed. The whole dynamic has changed here. It's changed enough where people went before Congress, right? And that wasn't the first instance, by the way. Others, Dr. Stephen Greer has brought a lot of people before Congress as well to discuss, military folks who have encountered these things, all right? But they initially were told, don't talk about it. Well, why? Well, there's massive sociological, religious, and national security issues that are involved here. So with that out of the way, let's get started. Now, I can't think of a better way to introduce this topic than with the most famous UFO/UAP incident in history. And that, of course, as you all know, is the Roswell Incident. And that's what we're going to talk about today, right? I could do a whole series of videos on the Roswell Incident alone because there's such a mythology here to this narrative. I mean, it's this legendary thing that occurred. But we're going to try to look at the facts and try and determine what happened through eyewitness testimony and secondary witness testimony and stuff like that. And then the government's explanation for what happened there in 1947. But like all investigations, we have to look at the context here. We have to look at the prevailing mindset of in the late 1940s, right? And the reason I'm mentioning this is because we need to rewind even further back to 1938, when the actor-director Orson Welles did a radio broadcast of H.G. Wells' book, the War of the Worlds. Now, Orson Welles and H.G. Wells are not related. It's just a really cool coincidence, right? So there was something called the Mercury Theater. Let me get that right. The Mercury Theater on the air program that broadcast, music, but Orson Welles interspersed the music with news bulletins. It started innocuously enough, talking about scientists witnessing explosions on Mars, right? Inexplicable, what's going on Mars? And then we hear that a little later in a later news bulletin that an asteroid or something has crashed in New Jersey, right? And then later on you find out that it's not an asteroid, that it's actually a spacecraft, right? And then you find out that they're from Mars and they're building these machines, and the machines have decimated, destroyed, and obliterated our Army, Air Force, and Navy. It's terrifying. Now, picture yourself, back then, it wasn't television, it was radio, so people listened to radio. And if you tuned in a little later, like Orson Welles talked about it in the beginning, what the program was, but if you tuned in after that, this was done so well that people panicked, got scared out of their wits, all right, thinking that Martians landed in New Jersey and now they're headed towards New York to wipe out New York, all right? Now, this sort of planted the seed for the idea that a civilization with superior technology and weaponry decided to invade the Earth. Our armies would be defenseless against them, right? They couldn't protect us. And that kind of set the stage. And ironically, a few years later, there were a lot of UFO sightings, some of the first UFO sightings that began to appear in the newspapers, and they were making headlines. Now, fast forward 9 years to 1947, around July 4th or 5th, we don't know the precise date, around those dates, there's something crashed in Roswell, New Mexico, all right? There was a storm the night before, and on a ranch that was about 75 miles outside of Roswell, New Mexico proper, right, in a town of Lincoln County, and this rancher's name was Mac Brazel. There's a picture of him. Now, Mac Brazel went out the next morning after this horrific storm and discovered this debris on his ranch. Now, he also was aware of the UFO phenomenon and the controversy and stuff and the hyperbole being promoted by the newspapers concerning this. So he didn't go to the newspapers, right? He went to the local sheriff in Roswell and he told him what happened. The sheriff contacted the Roswell Army Air Force Base, which was located, of course, in Roswell, and now, keep in mind, a lot of testing was done at this airbase, a lot of testing, all right? This was the Cold War and things like that, so a lot of stuff's going on. I'm going to talk about some of those programs that were in place at the time, or at least a few years after the Roswell crash. We'll talk about that in a moment. So the sheriff calls the Air Force sends somebody out to investigate, all right? And we'll get to the more details on that in a little bit. So what Mac Brazel and these other witnesses from the Air Force believed to be a flying saucer was initially explained away by the Air Force as a weather balloon, a high-altitude weather balloon, right? But here's the kicker. Only after the astonishing headline that is put forth by the Air Force itself, all right, RAAF, which is the Roswell Army Air Force, captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region. Wow. Okay, that was, whoa, all right? That went around the world really fast, right? That people were, what? So now they've captured a flying saucer, right? Interesting word, captures, isn't it? We'll get to that in a little bit. Now, 24 hours later, they retract the headline and say, no, nothing to see here. It was a weather balloon. Okay, all right. In fact, they took photographs of some of the military personnel holding the wreckage from a weather balloon. And that ended the story there. However, because the Air Force initiated that headline of capturing a flying saucer and then retracted it, guess what? They themselves created the conspiracy theories that have propagated since 1947, right? We're going to get to those too. A former CIA agent, Ben Smith, recently commented in an interview with Live Science, no other government in the world has said, we have a spacecraft. And then the next day released another press release that says, never mind, it was just a weather balloon. So therein lies part of the problem, right? Finally, in 1994, the government released a report called the Roswell Report, in where it tried to address these incessant conspiracy theories. So this report tried to clarify some of the issues that were talked about, the conspiracies. Essentially, the Air Force claimed it was not your ordinary everyday weather balloon that crashed in Roswell, but instead it was a top secret nuclear test surveillance balloon from a program called Project Mogul, right? And here's a picture of this device, and it's pretty sophisticated, pretty complicated. There's a lot of components to it. Now, for those of you who don't know, Project Mogul high-altitude balloons were designed with long-distance detection acoustic sensors, radar-reflecting targets, and nylon fibers carried by these massive weather balloons. What was the purpose? Well, the purpose was to listen for Soviet testing of nuclear weapons, okay? So this was before the era of satellites. The first satellite was launched, that ridiculous Sputnik thing that went beep, 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 in orbit of the Earth to scare the hell out of everybody, all right? Was launched in 1957, the year of my birthday. Kind of cool, all right? So we didn't have things like that in 1947. We didn't have high surveillance aircraft like the SR-71 Blackbird, which went so high at 80,000 feet or something like that. And at Mach 3, it's the only plane that was ever designed that didn't require weaponry because no one could catch it. It went too high and it flew too fast. So the Russians were very frustrated by that. But anyway, so it was taking pictures of the Russian installation. But before that, we didn't have anything, all right? So we needed to know what the Russians were doing with nuclear weapons. It was the Cold War. It's kind of spooky, the whole thing. So that's what we did. So they launched these high altitude balloons, right? So you can see if one of these things crashed, it would look, and you didn't know about this particular Project Mogul, it'd be kind of spooky. Say, what the hell is this thing, right? Now, others who were involved in the recovery of the crashed material claimed also that there were alien bodies, and this is the big piece of the story, right? There were alien bodies involved as well. It's pretty incredible, right? Now, and there were others. It wasn't just Mac Brazel, right? And we'll get to that in a minute. Now, these bodies were allegedly transported to the Roswell Army Airfield Hospital, autopsied there, and then sent to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. That's the story. That's the mythology behind it. Now, interestingly, historically, the narrative, or the conventional narrative that is, maintains that the claims of alien bodies being found was much later, in the 1970s, when people went back and started speaking to people about it. But I don't think that's necessarily true. And we're going to look at that as well. Now, in the Roswell Report, the Air Force also responded. I believe they released another version of it, like an addendum in 1997. The Air Force responded to the alien body scenario with a very interesting solution, all right? Now, they explained that between the years of 1953 and 1959, there was yet another top secret program called Project High Dive and another one called Project Excelsior. Now Project High Dive, they would put these anthropomorphic dummies. They would attach them to these high altitude balloons. They take them up to like 98,000 feet, and they drop these dummies that had parachutes on them. So now it's like, why would they do something like this? What is the point of this? Well, the idea was, in the event that aircraft kept flying higher and higher and higher, and pilots were more at risk if there was a malfunction at 90,000 feet or something like the SR-71. So they wanted to make sure that they wanted to see the effects of how these particular parachutes worked with human beings. Right? And eventually, there was a guy named Kittinger, I believe, who they eventually sent a man up there who did the testing. But initially, they started with these anthropomorphic crash test dummies. And that was the government's explanation for the alien bodies being found at the Roswell crash site, okay? Well, the only problem with that is that the Project High Dive began in 1953. 6 years after the Roswell incident. So, in all honesty, I wish the government had never, because I remember seeing the images and stuff, as you can see here. I just thinking to myself, I wish they hadn't even said this, because now it looks like they're kind of getting desperate to control the narrative, right? We're going to get to that concept as well, because it happened 6 years after the Roswell crash, these crash test dummy things. Any case. So additionally, there's one more thing I'd like to bring up that the government spoke about as well is there was the Viking lander that went to Mars. It's really, really cool stuff, and took a lot of really cool photographs and stuff of Mars, one of the first ones. And the testing for the lander was done at Roswell Army Air Force Base as well. And if you look at this thing, that looks like a UFO. Unfortunately, the testing was done in 1968. So our dear government has some issues with timeline here, okay? Because all of these things happened years after the Roswell incident, all right? So that's where I kind of say, I think they're just trying to control the narrative here with these rather interesting, fascinating programs that we were involved in, things that we were doing, right? So who are these witnesses? And what did they see? Let's find out. The witnesses. Now, here's where it gets really wild and very controversial. And for those of you who are on the fence or don't believe you've gotten this far in video, okay, this is really going to test your belief system, okay? Because some of this stuff is really wild. Now, some of this information is first-hand information, some of it's second-hand, and I'll let you know which is which. We're going to start, of course, with Mac Brazel, the rancher who found the debris on his ranch, went to the local sheriff, started going to the newspapers, and he contacted the Roswell Army Air Force Base, who put him in touch with a Major Jesse Marcel. Now, Jesse Marcel is perhaps the most important figure in the entire Roswell incident. He is the first person from the Air Force to go to the debris field, find the debris, realize or recognize that it was not a weather balloon. Now, maybe he didn't know about Project Mogul. I don't know, right? Maybe he didn't know. Nevertheless, he took some of that debris home that night. He put it in his truck, took it home, and put it through some testing. He took a sledgehammer to it, a blowtorch, all kinds of stuff. Tried to crumple it. Whatever he did, it would either not affect it or it would snap back to its original form. Kind of wild, okay? And his family was witness to this. As an example, Jesse Marcel Jr. vividly recalls his dad waking him up at night to show him the debris from the crashed vehicle and handling the debris as well. So he actually had it in his hands. His grandson, Jesse Marcel III, came forward and said his grandfather became the fall guy for the Air Force. All right? Essentially, Marcel was a person who recognized that this was perhaps otherworldly or material he had never seen before, never worked with before. Once the Air Force published that headline, he was contacted by a General Ramey from Washington who told him, "Are you out of your mind? All right, you can't publish this story. We got to change the headline, all right? We got to change it to make it a weather balloon, okay?" So if this is all true, Marcel had, after saying that they had found a flying saucer, right, he had seen the wreckage and worked with the wreckage, he had to say, "Oh, it's just a weather balloon, my bad." And here's a very famous photograph of him with the wreckage from a weather balloon, all right? The second part of this, and this is something we didn't discuss through the video here, is that according to legend, there was a second crash site. So the first crash site is where the UFO or the flying saucer hit the ground, and apparently parts of it broke off, and then it went, bounced 40 miles away to the final crash site. All right, which is the second crash site. And there are two witnesses from that crash site that I'd like to discuss right now. The first one is a Sergeant Melvin Brown, right? Now, Brown was the sergeant who took the debris and the bodies back to the Roswell Army Air Force Base for the autopsy, and for which we'll talk about in a minute, and for the debris. Now, when he got there, they had a tarp covering something, and of course his commanding officer said, "Do not look under that tarp," right? So anyway, essentially he was of course tempted. He peeked under the tarp and saw two dead alien bodies, right? He took those bodies and the debris, drove it in a truck back to the Roswell Air Force Base. So that's his testimony. Now, there's another testimony by a fireman who is unnamed at this point, and this fireman arrived at the second crash site to find 3 alien bodies and the remnants of a flying saucer, right? With the back of it had been blown off or something. So maybe an explosion happened inside the craft, if this is real, right? And the aliens were all killed. I'd say the most fantastic and most incredible witness, it's secondhand, okay, for last. His name is G.W. Glenn Dennis. He was a mortician in Roswell. He had his mortician practice, and he also worked at the Roswell Army Hospital, obviously for test pilots who died, right? So he helped at the hospital as well. Now, he receives a call asking him if he has 3 caskets for children that could be hermetically sealed. And he thought that was kind of weird. He said, well, I don't have them on hand, but I can order them for you. And they said, okay, we'll get back to you on this. So they did. An hour or so later, he got a second call from the same people at the Air Force Base asking him how to preserve bodies, what chemicals he uses to preserve bodies, and if these chemicals are used, will it affect the bodies themselves with the different layers of skin? So he's thinking, well, this is weird. I can come down and help you out. I work there. And they said, no, it's okay. We're thinking of doing it ourselves. Okay. So he thought the whole thing was a little strange to begin with, right? About an hour or so later, he gets another call. Well, this is actually about a pilot who had crashed, all right? And he was hurt and they needed him. So the military picked him up at his house. They drove him to where the crash site was, and he helped the pilot, some head injuries, went back to the Air Force Hospital, right, where he worked, right, sends a pilot into the urgent care room, the emergency room, and he's walking down the hall looking for a friend of his, this woman, a nurse who he had worked with several times, and he liked her and he wanted to see how she's doing. He sees her coming out of a room down the hall, and she is distraught and she looks like she's sick. And she says to him, what are you doing here? You need to leave. And he says, what do you mean? What am I doing here? I work here. She says, you need to leave right away. Get out of here. So I can't talk about it right now, but you've got to go. You've got to get out. She walks into another room. Weird. So he's walking down the hall. He's essentially harassed by 2 Army officers. One of them says, if you don't get out of here, you don't get the hell out of here, they're going to be picking up your bones out of the desert sand, right? This is what he says to him. You can watch his interview on the National Archives. It's really incredible, right? So he's escorted by 2 military police back to his home, right? So he calls the base the next day to talk to the nurse to see what happened. What is this all about, right? The nurse says, let's meet for coffee. I'll tell you about it. And she's upset. He meets her for coffee. And she tells him the most fantastic story, this whole thing, out of the whole Roswell story. So essentially what happened is she was on her rounds. She walks into a surgical room, and in the room were 2 doctors and 3 bodies. The stench was so bad, she had to literally walk out of the room again. And this is a person who's worked with dead bodies. She's a nurse at an Air Force base where there are deaths from test pilots, right? So she goes back in the room. The doctor said, get in here because we need your help. And she's like, what's going on? And she sees what they're working on. And apparently 2 of the bodies were badly mangled. The 3rd body looked like it had survived and then died. All right. So these doctors are working on this alien body, and she is astonished. And they said, shut up and help us out here. So she's helping. Meanwhile, the doctors had to leave occasionally because the stench from the bodies was so bad that they couldn't deal with it. It was, very unusual. Same with her. She kept leaving, coming in. And while she was going to the bathroom, she ran into Dennis, the mortician. She's telling him the story, and he is beyond belief. He cannot believe it. This is the craziest stuff I've ever heard, right? So then I want to read you the description she gives him of the alien bodies, right? And it's very specific. It's very interesting. So I'm going to read this to you. They had large heads, no hair on the body, almost transparent skin, very fine lips, no teeth inside the mouth, rawhide-like gums, 2 small earlobe flaps, 2 small holes for the nose, large black eyes, hands with no thumbs and no fingernails, and about 3 feet tall. While she's telling him, she's distressed, she's scared, she doesn't know what's going to happen to us. I don't know what's going to happen to me. I saw this. I know that they're going to transfer me or something. In any case, he leaves, he goes home, he calls the base the next day to see how she's doing. She's not available. He calls the day after that, she's been transferred, all right? 3 weeks later, he gets a letter from her with a P.O. box saying, you can talk to me this way. He sends her a note saying, hope you're okay. A few weeks after that, he gets the letter back saying she is deceased, that she was killed in a training exercise in Germany, along with 5 other nurses. So finally, the last thing I want to talk about, if you've gotten this far, is the Roswell Headline. Let's conclude. Now, there's one thing I want to talk about, one last final thing, and I've been mentioning it throughout the video, and it is the original headline released by the Air Force. RAAF, Roswell Army Air Force, captures flying saucer. The word that bothers me here is captures. First of all, if it was a crash, what exactly did they capture? A dead alien? No, what is it that they captured? Well, they didn't capture anything. They discovered it, right? It already crashed, if this is true. But the reason I believe it's true is because of that word. One word, captures. What is the narrative? They're obviously trying to control the narrative. What is it trying to tell us? That they have control over the situation, right? We've captured this flying saucer, right? It's in our possession, our custody. That's why I believe that the Roswell incident, there's some truth to it because of that one word. If they had said discovered, found, all right, okay, I would have said, okay, that's not a damning headline. But the fact that they used the word captures means that they wanted to control the narrative. And that's what this is all about. Who's controlling the narrative and why? Why were they controlling the narrative? Remember the broadcast of 1938, the War of the Worlds broadcast. People were scared out of their wits. They recognized that our military, our Air Force and Navy were incapable of defending us in light of the technology of this civilization, whoever this is. So what did the Air Force do? They wanted to make sure that everybody knew it was okay, that they had captured it. I hope you liked the video. If you like it, please click the like button, all right? Give it a thumbs up, rather. If you want to subscribe, please subscribe, because I'd love to do a series of these videos on all this different stuff. And I think I'm just so fascinated by it. I always have been since a little kid. In any case, I hope you had a great time watching this. I hope this made sense. I hope you found it interesting and fascinating. Please leave me your comments, and I will see you hopefully for episode 2.